can see myself.
Oh,
Right. Thanks, both of you. Okay, we're here to celebrate Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. And I'm hoping you can all hear me all right. Good, because if you can't, make a face or something. In the publicity for this talk, I asked you to imagine Camden Town about 100 years ago, probably a damp, drizzly, miserable day like this one. And you see the figure of a tall, quite heavy looking man walking down the street with a very determined stride, heading towards central London, maybe with a bag of books under his arm, quite formally dressed in a dark suit with black rimmed glasses. And if you look closely at him, you'd see that unusually for Camden Town 100 years ago, he was an Indian. And he's heading towards central London, maybe to the British Museum reading room, or maybe further on to the London School of Economics, where he's pursuing a doctorate. And this is Dr. or the future Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. Clearly, he's a very highly motivated student with a rather determined, quite serious look about him. And if you were to hang about, you'd see him coming back in the evening, going to his digs, which are just near Chalk Farm Tube Station. And nowadays, they're a museum. In fact, he's commemorated at both ends of his daily walk to his studies. His digs in King Henry's Walk, Primrose Hill, or Chalk Farm, are now a museum. And the London School of Economics has both an oil painting and a bust of Ambedkar, commemorating him as one of their most important and most respected alumni or former pupils. So who was this fellow and what's he doing in Camden Town or at the London School of Economics? He was born in India about 30 years before, in 1891. And he was born in a military area. His father was an army officer in the Indian Army, which may make him sound, quite well off. But he and his father, his whole family, were from an untouchable caste. And it's quite difficult to explain the Indian caste system quickly. But you find, if you look at the caste system, that you may be born into one of four major castes or varnas. But Ambedkar wasn't born into one of those castes. He was born to an even lower group, the untouchables. And it's quite significant that a Hindu would believe that actually touching a person from that caste was polluting, was in some way dangerous. And the various there was lots and lots of different untouchable castes. And Ambedkar and his father came from one called the Mahars. The Mahars made very good soldiers. There are lots of stories of their bravery and prowess in battle. And so the British were quite keen to recruit Mahars to serve in the army. And any untouchable, any Mahar soldier would get his children sent to school. And that's what happened to young Bhimrao Ambedkar. So he's the son of an army officer. He's sent to school. That sounds like it's pretty okay. But as far as his teachers were concerned, and as far as his fellow pupils were concerned, he was still an untouchable. He wasn't actually allowed into the classroom. He got very little help, if any, from the teachers. And a story that I read is that if he wanted a drink of water, and a school servant had to pour it, and had to pour it from a sufficient height that somehow the others weren't polluted. I really don't quite get it. But he said, you know, if the servant took the day off, he spent a day at school and didn't get a drink of water. And in India, in the hot weather, that's pretty serious. He didn't get a seat or a desk, he sat on a sack. In spite of this, he managed to complete school, and he was sent to a college of the University of Bombay, where he did his first degree. And it's quite significant that when he was about 20 years old, he was given a book, a biography of the Buddha, as a prize for passing various English exams. And he got a degree in economics and politics. After that, one of the local royal families of one of the Indian princely states that you got under the British Empire gave him a scholarship to Columbia University in New York, where he finished an MA in economics. His first degree was economics and politics. And he managed to get a second MA, I think, at Columbia. He gets so many qualifications that I'm not sure I can quite keep count. And in the middle of the First World War, he comes to London. He does a master's at the London School of Economics. He does a PhD in economics at the London School of Economics. And in between all that, he does the bar course at Gray's Inn as well. It's an absolutely astonishing academic achievement for anybody. He got 2 doctorates, by the way. I can't quite remember where the other one was. As I said, I have to confess. And the man got so many academic qualifications that it's difficult to keep up. He actually ended up with 4 doctorates, but 2 of them were honorary and 2 of them he worked for. As I said, an astonishing academic record, and one that's still very much respected by his alma mater, the London School of Economics. And I did want to bring in that link with North London, that he was a resident of North London. He's remembered and commemorated in North London, and because his main influence is in India. But in some ways, he's a North London person as well. In spite of those extraordinary qualifications, back in India, he found it quite difficult to make a living. I think one of his businesses failed. He had an assortment of teaching jobs. The other teachers refused to share a water jug with him because they recognized that he was a Dalit. And he became involved in the campaign for Indian independence. And so he was familiar with people whose names we'd recognize, like Nehru, Gandhi, Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan. He seems to have spent an awful lot of time quarreling with both Nehru and Gandhi, mainly over rights and representation for the Dalit or the untouchable communities. Ambedkar had argued very, very strongly for separate representation for the Dalits. But Gandhi went on one of his famous hunger strikes, and eventually Ambedkar was persuaded, very much against his will, to withdraw the demand for separate representation for Dalits. And I think Ambedkar just did not trust high caste Hindus to represent the interests of Dalits, or indeed to treat Dalits with any sort of respect at all. And given the sort of experiences that he'd had and the experiences that his fellow Mahars had experienced, you can understand why. He was involved in various campaigns. One was simply for allowing Dalits to get the same right to drinking water as the caste Hindus. And he promoted and encouraged Dalits to get educated. He promoted the rights of women, particularly Dalit women. And one famous occasion, one stunt that he pulled, which I rather admire, he took what were called the Manusmriti, the traditional Hindian rules about the caste system, and very publicly burnt them in front of a large crowd. He clearly was quite a strong political operator. By 1935, he had announced that he wanted to convert out of Hinduism to another religion. And shortly after that, 1936, he published a short but very important essay on the subject, and the title is The Annihilation of Caste. When I finish talking, I'll pop these sort of titles into the chat. You can now quite easily get hold of a paperback edition of The Annihilation of Caste with a commentary by the novelist Arundhati Roy, and it's worth reading. It's very interesting. During the 1930s, he seems to have spent quite a lot of time investigating non-Hindu religions. The list I've got includes Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. And it is quite important to be aware of how long he spends thinking about converting to Buddhism, because some of his critics say that he only converted to Buddhism because his political career wasn't going as well as he hoped. But in fact, it seems that he had a very, very long-standing interest in Buddhism, going back very many years. As India moved towards becoming an independent country, he became the law minister in the new Indian government and was the chairman of the committee that drafted the democratic constitution of India, which still exists today. Even though I think a lot of people think that the current government may be threatening democracy in India. The democratic constitution is largely credited to Ambedkar. And in the constitution, the constitution outlawed caste, although that seems to have been more on paper than in practice. It allowed for freedom of religion. It promoted the rights of women, and also promoted affirmative action or reserved places in government jobs for the Dalit or untouchable communities. But by 1950, he seems to have lost his seat in Parliament. He was getting on in years, and he began to explore Buddhism quite seriously. And it's during this period that he had some contact with the founder of our movement, with Sangharakshita. And just before, in about 1956, he publishes his last book, which you can see here it's not in mirror writing, that's just the way it appears on Zoom, The Buddha and His Dharma, which is intended as a kind of reference book or Bible for the new Buddhists that he was going to convert. The big event took place in a central Indian city called Nagpur on the 14th of October, 1956. And he and his wife took the refuges and precepts from the senior most Buddhist monk in India at the time, a Burmese man called U Chandramani. Now, they did that in front of an enormous crowd of maybe 400,000, maybe 500,000 Dalits who had been invited for the occasion. And once Ambedkar and his wife had taken the refuges and precepts themselves, Ambedkar turned and addressed the crowd and led them through 22 special vows, leaving Hinduism behind and converting at one go 400,000 to 500,000 people to Buddhism. The figures, the numbers actually become quite staggering. I mean, I know at the North London Centre, if we get 3 or 4 people who become mitras in one day, we think we're doing well. The sort of numbers that are involved in these mass conversions to Buddhism are quite astonishing. Ambedkar was not a man in good health, and he was getting on in years. He seemed to have a whole series of health problems. He had diabetes, he had poor eyesight, tendency to be rather on the heavy side. And I think it's 7 weeks after the mass conversion, he died. It's quite, his death, left thousands upon thousands of his followers, really quite sort of bereft and quite shocked and demoralized. A lot of them were from the Mahar subcaste. He'd already met Sangharakshita in 1952. They'd been corresponding for a couple of years. And after Ambedkar's death, Sangharakshita himself gave quite a series of talks to the former untouchable, former Hindus, the new Buddhists. He led another conversion of round about 200,000. And they, there were several other sort of mass conversions here and there, mostly around central India. And they think that by the time that Ambedkar died, 7 weeks after the first mass conversion, and there were about 750,000 new Buddhists in India. As I said, he'd met Sangharakshita a couple of times before the first mass conversion and actually asked Sangharakshita if he'd do it. But it was only 9 years after Indian independence, and I think Sangharakshita quite rightly saw that having a British monk conducting this mass conversion would look as if the new Buddhists were nostalgic for the British Empire, that it wouldn't really work. And he suggested U Chandramani, the senior monk from Burma, instead. Sangharakshita spent a lot of time with Ambedkar's new Buddhists in the 10 years or so following Ambedkar's death. He reckoned actually just between 1959 and 1961, he gave about 400 lectures and managed to convert another 100,000 people. And just to sort of wrap up a little bit, according to the 2011 census, there were 8.44 million Buddhists in India. Now, by way of comparison, in the 1941 census, there were 2,489. So it's an enormous change for Buddhism worldwide, returning to the land of its birth in a big way. And I think Sanganath will be able to speak very well about how this has changed the lives of the people who converted and their children and their grandchildren. The story is not entirely rosy. There is still a lot of discrimination against Dalits. There's still a lot of discrimination against the ex-Dalit Buddhists. Still, I mean, for example, a friend of mine who runs tours around India says that if he's talking to somebody he doesn't know in connection with his business, he always speaks in English, because if he speaks in the local language, Marathi, his accent gives him away, and he's likely to be mistreated in one way or another. There's also quite a lot of sexual violence, particularly against Dalit women, and violence up to and including murder. So it's not all over yet. But nonetheless, the people who I've spoken to have said that the Dharma has transformed their lives. And if you take a stroll around the markets or the shanty towns of Nagpur, you will see pictures of Dr. Ambedkar everywhere. Or you can go to the London School of Economics. So that's really a gallop through a very rich and a very, very, very important life.